Bueno, pues quiero tomar 2 minutitos simplemente para agradecerles a todos y cada uno de ustedes su puntual presencia aquí, para darle la bienvenida a nuestra invitada, la doctora Susan Rose-Ackerman. It's an honor to have you here, Susan. We want to offer you a warm welcoming with an aplauso para Susan. And we are very deeply honored of having you here. Quiero agradecer a nuestras autoridades del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales la generosidad que han tenido para esta gran inauguración de la primera sesión de nuestro proyecto de rendición de cuentas y combate a la corrupción, y agradecerle a nuestra secretaria académica, la doctora Silvia Inclán, que nos va a hacer el honor de conducir esta primera sesión, de presentar a la doctora, de darle la bienvenida y evidentemente de conducir la discusión que generosamente tanto la doctora Guadalupe Correa, que hoy está con nosotros, pues como miembro de la UNAM en su sabático en el CIALC, pero que viene de Estados Unidos, de la Universidad George Mason, y el doctor Maximiliano García Guzmán, también gran amigo, gran colega de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales, especialista en Derecho Administrativo y en todas estas cuestiones importantes de la administración pública. Nos van a dar sus reflexiones más profundas al respecto de la plática que nos va a compartir la doctora Susan. Entonces le agradezco muchísimo a la doctora Inclán y le dejo el micrófono para que conduzca esta sesión. Gracias, doctora.
Gracias, Irma. Pues un gusto estar aquí con ustedes y un gusto estar de moderadora, porque así no me pierdo la plática y la visita de la doctora Susan Rose-Ackerman. Voy a hacer una breve presentación de la doctora y de los comentaristas con sus semblanzas. La doctora Susan Rose-Ackerman es una académica estadounidense especialista en el estudio de la corrupción desde la economía política y el derecho administrativo comparado. Es profesora emérita de la cátedra Henry R. Luce de jurisprudencia de la Facultad de Derecho de la Universidad de Yale y ha desarrollado una trayectoria académica centrada en el análisis de las fallas institucionales que permiten la corrupción en el diseño de políticas públicas para fortalecer la transparencia y el Estado de Derecho. Su obra más influyente es Corruption and Government Causes, Consequences and Reform, considerado un referente internacional en los estudios sobre la corrupción, donde analiza sus causas, efectos sobre la legitimidad gubernamental y las estrategias institucionales para combatirla. A lo largo de su carrera ha colaborado con organismos internacionales como el Banco Mundial y la ONU en el desarrollo de marcos y políticas anticorrupción para países en desarrollo. Su relación con México y con la Universidad Nacional ha sido significativa tanto en el plano intelectual como institucional, y sus planteamientos teóricos sobre temas como captura del Estado, la regulación del financiamiento de los partidos políticos y la integridad pública han influido en investigaciones desarrolladas en el Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas y aquí. Asimismo, ha participado en diversos foros académicos organizados por la UNAM y por instituciones gubernamentales mexicanas, donde ha compartido su experiencia en materia de transparencia, combate a la corrupción y fortalecimiento institucional. La va a comentar la para todos conocida doctora Irma Sandoval, pero vamos a presentar también, investigadora del Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales y coordinadora del Laboratorio de Documentación y Análisis de la Corrupción y Transparencia. Es doctora en Ciencia Política por la Universidad de California, maestra en Estudios Latinoamericanos por la UNAM y en Ciencia Política por la Universidad de California, y además es economista y socióloga. Es investigadora a nivel del SNI nivel 3 y ha sido reconocida con el primer lugar del Premio Manuel Espinosa Iglesias por su investigación sobre la corrupción en el sistema financiero. Fue becaria Edmond J. Zafra de la Universidad de Harvard y titular de la Cátedra Alfonso Reyes para México, Centroamérica y el Caribe de la Sorbona de París. Y en el ámbito público se ha desempeñado como secretaria de la Función Pública entre 2018 y 2021 y fue diputada constituyente de la Ciudad de México de 16 a 17, donde integró la mesa directiva de la Comisión de Buen Gobierno, Combate a la Corrupción y Régimen de Responsabilidades de los Servicios Públicos. Voy a presentar también, va a comentar el trabajo de la doctora Rose-Ackerman, el doctor Maximiliano García Guzmán, que es doctor en Ciencias Políticas y Sociales con orientación en Administración Pública por la UNAM y se desempeña actualmente como profesor de tiempo completo en el Centro de Estudios en Administración Pública de la Facultad de Ciencias Políticas y Sociales. Y ahí pues ha desarrollado una trayectoria importante en docencia, investigación y formación de estudiantes y es miembro del SNI y ha participado también en diversos proyectos académicos de investigación relacionados con el estudio de las políticas públicas y el fortalecimiento institucional. Y en reconocimiento a su labor, en 2014 recibió la distinción Universidad Nacional para Jóvenes Académicos en el área de docencia en Ciencias Sociales, que es uno de los más altos reconocimientos que otorga la universidad a su personal académico. Y también va a comentar el trabajo de la doctora Rose-Ackerman, la doctora Guadalupe Correa Cabrera. Ella es profesora en la Universidad George Mason, ya nos decía Irma, especialista en estudios fronterizos, seguridad, migración, narcotráfico y relaciones México-Estados Unidos. Antes fue profesora de la Universidad de Texas, Valle de Río Grande, donde impartía cursos sobre seguridad y política internacional. Es autora y coautora de diversos libros sobre política, crimen organizado y seguridad en México, entre los que destacan Los Zetas, INC, Democracy in Two Mexicos, La Guerra Improvisada y Las 5 Vidas de Genaro García Luna. También ha coordinado obras colectivas sobre la región fronteriza y sus dinámicas comparadas. Ha ocupado cargos académicos relevantes como presidir la Association for Borderland Studies y es coeditora de la revista International Studies Perspectives, vinculada a la Oxford University Press, y se dedica a la investigación y análisis periodístico en temas de seguridad, narcotráfico y delincuencia organizada, participando como columnista en medios como Sin Embargo y La Opinión, así como en espacios de análisis público sobre la situación de la seguridad en México. Bueno, pues una vez presentados las personalidades que vamos a escuchar, le doy la palabra a la doctora Susan Rose-Ackerman. Rose, you're very welcome and we would like to hear you now.
Gracias.
All right. Time. Maybe half an hour, 20 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, can
All
you
right.
do 20 minutes?
Yes, I think so. I'll watch. I have. You can wave at me if I should stop talking.
All right. Feel free.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here and generous introduction. I could understand enough Spanish to hear praise, right? So thank you. Anyway, this paper that I asked Eréndira to circulate to you is maybe a little different from, or it is for me at least, something new. I've written a lot about corruption. You may have read some parts of my book, Corruption in Government, which is co-authored with a woman who's a professor, Bonnie Palifka, who's a professor at Monterey Tech. And it's a topic I've been interested in for a long time, ever since I was teaching a undergraduate course at Yale College on urban problems, and noticed that there was corruption in a bunch of government programs providing subsidies for housing, and began to think, a little economics would help you understand why that program had corruption in it and other ones might not have done it the way it was the way it was designed. And we can talk about that later. What I want to talk about today is, as I said, something new for me, because I have combined an interest in corruption with an interest in the way the state works, with administrative law, public administration. And wanting to focus not so much on the criminal law cracking down on people. Obviously, that's got to be a part of any anti-corruption activity, but more what I've been most interested in is how is it that the design of a public program has created incentives for people to pay bribes, and given people's self-interest in financial gain, you can talk about how the design of a program creates incentives for corruption, and suggesting that that policy should not just be focused on trying to catch individuals who did bad things, but trying to ask how to structurally reform and organize the way the state operates. And I think Eréndira has been also interested in many of those things. So here in this paper, I've been taking on, along with a co-author, one angle of this. And I should say that my co-author is a Norwegian economist who I've known for a long time. I've collaborated with her on some things on corruption. And she was head of the Norwegian antitrust agency for 3 years. And so has some real experience inside the way the government operating and the tensions that arise in doing that. And she was visiting last fall at Yale, and this paper came out of that collaboration with her. So the part that links back to our joint interest in corruption is the part of it that has to do with anti-money laundering. A very important aspect of certain kinds of large-scale corrupt deals. The people make money, say in Mexico or in Brazil or in Zimbabwe, and they don't want it to stay there. They want it to get somewhere else. So they want to use the banking system to get it, into the United States or into London or into Frankfurt or somewhere like that. And it is the thing that is sort of distinctive about money laundering is that the way the law has been working, at least in the U.S., and I need to learn from you something about Mexico, because I don't know much about Mexico other than that it happens, probably, right? So you can tell me in the question.
We don't have that in Mexico.
No.
We don't have that.
Yeah. And of course, the money laundering that happens in Mexico is in collaboration with institutions in the U.S. or somewhere else. Right? It's not just Mexico all by itself. That's the whole point. You're trying to launder it, so it doesn't look like it's bad money. So we're interested in the way in which money laundering operates. And as I was saying, the distinctive thing about that as a problem is that you're asking banks who are just want to transfer money. It's just money. They just want to transfer the money. And then you tell them, some of that money came from some kinds of illicit activity, criminal activity, and it's up to you, the banks, to have reports, to file reports with the state about what's going on. And the banks don't, of course, like that, right? I mean, they may go along with it, but they say, you're taking on a job that's the state's job to figure out what's the problem, and we realize that we have all this compliance requirement forms that we have to fill out, things that we have to do, but it makes it a kind of a distinctive problem in that the control of money laundering is being put on the shoulders not just of the state but on private banks, which are, of course, the node, the place where it is happening. The second thing we looked at is antitrust, which is not directly connected with corruption in most cases, bribes in the sense, that kind of corruption, but may certainly be connected with illegal or is defined through the law as certain kinds of economic activity being illegal activity, particularly cartel activity, monopolizing markets. And those could be perfectly legal markets. They're not markets in drugs. They're not markets in automobiles or coal or something like that, right? And there can be monopolization in those markets, which works against the competitive forces in the market. So, and Tina, as I said, has this really on the ground experience in how a antitrust things might work. So both of these things raise a set of interesting questions, enforcement questions, in the sense that in both cases they are mostly across the world, and I think in Mexico, but you can tell me, carried out through individual cases. That merger is going to be anti-competitive. That cartel in this particular area is smothering competition. That bank is located in our country or outside of our country, is a source, has made it easy for people who have illicit funds to get them out of the country. So the enforcement has mostly been at the level of individual cases. Let's bring the individual cases and see what happens. I have mostly in my other work, mostly focused on regulatory areas like the environment, where much of what happens, at least in the US, is you have a statute, and then the agency that's supposed to be enforcing the statute promulgates general regulations. So as they say, we say a law that says control air pollution, right? And then there's a regulation that sets up standards that companies have to fulfill in order to comply with the law. And so the process of promulgating that regulation is a very important part of the law. That to what extent is it based on scientific information, scientific expertise? To what extent is there consultation with civil society groups, with industry groups, with labor groups that might have an interest or a concern with what's happening? Does the state have to give general public reasons to everybody about what they did? Is there a way to challenge it? So those are the things that I know the most about. But that's not these areas. And although, in fact, one of our arguments in the paper is that it would actually improve things, we think, if the agencies charged with antitrust or charged with anti-money laundering could think more generically about what they're doing and operate more through a general rulemaking process that was tied in some way to democratic accountability, to getting expert information, and then to explaining what the general rule is, and needing to justify it and give reasons. So let's think a little bit about the antitrust area for a bit. The part of it that has to do with focusing on getting rid of cartels, on getting rid of mergers, and very often what happens, at least in the U.S., is that there's two kind of problems here. One is operating through guidelines rather than rules, right? So at least in the U.S., we have things called merger guidelines, in which somebody wants to merge with somebody, some firm wants to merge with another firm, and the question is, will that be anti-competitive? Will that reduce the competitiveness of the market? And they set up some guidelines about giving some information to firms about when the agency is likely to prosecute this or not prosecute it, let it go forward or not let it go forward. But they're just guidelines; they're not general rules. You could imagine that those being converted not as guidelines but as general background regulations that would ex ante tell as a rule, as a legal thing, what's possible to do. Oops, all right, my papers are blowing away. And so we'll get to another page here. And there's a similar kind of thing in the anti-money laundering stuff. You may have you're looking around both of them, you have big cases that get a lot of press. Some whole bank is being criticized or brought laws being enforced against them for being too deeply involved in money laundering. And always in those cases when there might be a choice between using the criminal law to go after somebody or some kind of a structural administrative revenue. what's the advantage of the criminal law as opposed to something else? Sometimes you might not have a choice, but it's a real choice, because it sounds superficially, criminal law, that's great, that's tough. That's what shows being tough, criminal law. But of course, the problem with the criminal law is the very reason that just because it's such a tough way to go after people, the people who are being accused of crimes have quite a lot of rights to push back, quite a lot of way to delay things, to try to make their case. And that's right. If you're accused of a crime, you should have you as an individual should have an ability to push back. But it does mean that things get delayed, things don't happen, and if you're just doing everything by case adjudication, it may mean that the law enforcement authority is missing or not thinking about some broader structural questions about how the whole banking system is organized, or how a particular industry and antitrust is organized in a way that might reduce the incentives to carry out money laundering or anti-competitive behavior. So that's the first issue about making it. It's a choice for the law writer to make, right? It's not a choice that the administrator can usually make. Although you may, as an administrator, have a choice about whether to pursue something through a criminal track or through an administrative track. And part of the point here is that just saying, well, criminal, great, sure, I should always do that, will not always be the correct response if your interest is in trying to reform the way in which a particular market operates, or a particular money laundering thing operates. And there are additional set of interesting issues that come in when it's a corporation that's involved. Right? So there's a lot of complicated questions about whether a corporation, a legal person, right? And then people use, at least in English, the word person, whether a legal person can be guilty of a crime. Right? And of course,
we said here moral person.
A moral person.
Moral person, not legal person.
Okay, but it has some legal consequences.
Yeah, of course.
And in the United States, we're very cavalier about it. There's no problem with calling a corporation a legal person from the point of view of imposing the criminal law on them. Many countries in Europe do not have corporate criminal liability. The idea being that they can't feel guilty. They don't have personality, so they can't feel guilty, and so therefore they can't be criminals. But they can be held civilly responsible for things. They can be fined, but it just can't be called a crime. For corruption, actually, the French, this is a principle that comes out of French law, the idea of to be held criminally liable, you have to it has to be possible that you could reform in a kind of moral sense. Right? But and that, as I said, originated in French law, but even the French have changed their law for corruption only, so that they can hold corporations criminally liable.
The French.
Yeah, but not Germany. I don't think Norway either. And I don't know about, probably not the EU. So any case, does that matter? Maybe it's just as well that a corporation can't be held criminally liable if, as I was saying before, some of the ways to deal with these difficult problems of antitrust, of money laundering, is to think of it as a problem of the organization of the way in which institutions in society are being organized, and how they should be constrained and controlled by law, through requirements by law, but not necessarily have to put the sort of crime label on it. But it would involve not just not using the crime label, but also being more governments, enforcers being more sophisticated about structural remedies, which are not just imposing fines, but about reorganizing markets or reorganizing things. So it's because one difficulty when you talk to people who work on antitrust, and we did, not just Tina, but some other people, there is a problem within the community of people who bring antitrust cases and enforce antitrust, is the worry the corporations that are found to have violated the antitrust laws, and they say, okay, you have to pay, $500 million, a couple $1 million. They say, it's just the cost of doing business. We're doing all this other stuff. This is just the cost we just write it off on our balance sheet. And that's a general problem with relating penalties to behavior. And it seems to be especially a problem when the entity that we're talking about is an institution, not a person. And that if you're really concerned with, if you, the government agency, are really concerned with more competitive markets or less dirty money, getting into the rest of the system, the focus should be on structural remedies, on behavioral changes that particular firms have to make, and that are then act as models in other situations. And that was part of our concern. And I think Tina, in her work within the Norwegian antitrust authority, bumped right up against that set of questions in terms of what cases would be approved to go forward. How would you think about going forward? And what you notice when you're, I guess, an administrator in that position, you probably noticed it yourself when you were in government, right? You see a sort of a structural thing that's a problem, and you see some people who are violating the rules, and you say, oh, I'm really mad at those people, and that's fine. But the ultimate goal is not just to kind of punish individual people, but to kind of think about ways in which the markets and have been affected. Maybe I think I'm going to about my time, but one thing I thought was interesting in looking at the European cases, and you can tell me about Mexico, is the language of human rights being applied to corporations. So I think we're used to thinking about human rights as about human beings, right? People, and so you tend to be, very, very concerned with human rights violations having to do with social welfare, with social welfare, with health, with education, with housing, with things like that, with the way in which people are treated in prison, individualized things. But corporations sometimes say, "Oh, we're people." Moral people or whatever, and so therefore human rights apply to us, and I think that's unfortunate. Although even thus you have to recognize that of course corporations have rights, have legal rights as legal entities that they will of course refer to protect themselves, but invoking the language of human rights seems to be not what's the right word to say? Not appropriate. That's the kind of vague way to say it. And it turns out that in the European case, if the fine is too big, that then gets interpreted as you need to be treated as if you were a moral person. Now, of course, there are people. Any of these institutions have people behind them, and you can go after some of those people, but it's once again pointing. I think my general point that I'm trying to make, and maybe I've just made it several times, is that the way to go, we better in both of these areas for more thinking to be about not getting the particular bad guys. That needs to be a part of it, obviously, but not just that, but about what is it in the underlying structural systems and the relationship between the state and society and the banks and society operate that leads to people doing these things, and that if we recognize that if there are chances for private gain, individuals and institutions are likely to take advantage of them, and so part of the enforcement process should not just be going. I don't mean to deny you need to go after the bad guys individually sometimes, but if you just concentrate on that, you're going to miss the fact that there's a reason why those bad guys have picked that particular market or that particular set of issues to go after, and not something else, and that needs to be a piece of the way in which public officials, governments think about it, and courts are not going to do that. courts are not very good at making, sometimes courts get asked, as they have in the United States, to design structural remedies for something. It's happened in some areas having to do with school systems, urban school systems, or institutions for people of severe development disabilities, and where the courts are ordering an institution to reform itself. Those have usually not worked out well because the courts do not have bureaucracies to do these things. Okay, 3 minutes is perfect. Courts do not have the bureaucratic capacity to be the structural reformers themselves. They can oversee it and be background actors in this area. But if we're talking, because this is part of administrative law. You guys, I realize, are not lawyers, most of you. I'm not, but I'm not a lawyer either. But I kind of play like I am.
Who's
right?
Lawyer here?
No lawyer, no lawyer, none.
Except your son.
And he didn't go to law school. Right? Yeah, I didn't go to law school. You can learn law. Don't be scared of law, right? That's the basic point. The lawyers like to say they know it all, but they don't, right? So, but anyway, that's basically my message.
Oh, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'll pass the microphone. Susan. I'm sorry, Susan Rose. I am sorry. I am so sorry. So I'll give the microphone to Irma for the first comment.
Thank you so much, Silvia. Thank you. We are really deeply honored to host here such an outstanding research you've seen. I was telling my students how inspired by you my work is, and I am very, very thankful for your contributions here in El Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, and particularly in our seminar. And the idea, Susan, let me tell you this, is that most of us understood your message in English, but most of us will be speaking in Spanish, and you will have your personal translator. So feel free, siéntanse libres de participar, por favor, en español o en inglés, si ustedes quieren practicar y contribuir en inglés. Y mi contribución muy acotada será precisamente sobre la base de 3 asuntos que Susan nos pone. En particular, el tema de lo individual, la base del desarrollo individual de los casos sobre el desarrollo general de las soluciones. Una palabra que Susan nunca dijo, pero que está abajo de esto, one word you never mentioned, but in my word is very important, is impunity. For me, structural corruption is incredibly linked to impunity. ¿No? Siempre he dicho, ustedes lo saben, que la hermana siamesa de la corrupción estructural es la impunidad. Y que sin impunidad no habría tanta corrupción en México, y que precisamente la corrupción se vuelve estructural porque se alimenta de la impunidad. Hay una cuestión muy fuerte, y creo que lo que dice Susan de carry on individual basis versus aplicar una base más general tiene que ver con la impunidad. Y entonces ese es el primer punto que me gustaría que le tradujeras a Susan, Regina. You got it? Perfect.
She got what you said.
Perfect. Okay. Entonces, la aplicación de las reglas más generales versus la aplicación de las reglas caso por caso. ¿Qué tanto se vincula la impunidad en México? La segunda cuestión que me gustaría retomar del caso de Susan es esto del criminal law sobre administrative law, o sea, el derecho penal sobre el derecho administrativo. Ella nos dice, si ustedes entendieron bien y leyeron bien en el texto, que muchas veces el derecho administrativo es más útil, digamos, más fértil en el caso del lavado de dinero que el caso del criminal law, que suena más bonito para la prensa y suena más mediático y suena más político aplicar la ley criminal, pero que a lo mejor la ley administrativa, dice ella, podría tener mejor resultado. Yo lo quiero poner en el caso nuestro mexicano, que además ella está aprendiendo, quiere aprender de nosotros, de nuestras reflexiones del caso nuestro mexicano al revés. O sea, y yo habiendo sido secretaria de la Función Pública, que es el nodo del derecho administrativo sancionador, es decir, del derecho del law track, ¿no? Ha habido más problemas para castigar y para acabar con la impunidad, precisamente porque lo empujamos en el administrative law y no aplicamos el criminal law. Entonces, quiero jugar también con eso, no sé si eso le puedes ayudar.
She wants to focus on how the Mexican case has limitation, because here administrative law is limited, and there's not been a way of tracking criminal law to be able to do what it needs to do.
Yeah, maybe in Mexico we have the other way around the case, no? The administrative law track is more complicated than the criminal law. I mean, all these cases that you were sharing with us, that the corporations and the persons that are involved in these cases can delay the cases. That traditionally applied more to the administrative track than the criminal track. Y la tercera cuestión con la que yo concluiría, si me permite, Silvia, es el tema de esto que nos dice la doctora, de que en Europa no hay posibilidad de castigar a las corporaciones porque no son personas, ¿no? Y que el único país, dice, que se ha roto un poco con este tema, solo para el caso de la corrupción, no para el caso que estamos hablando aquí, que es el blanqueamiento de activos y el lavado de dinero, pero para corrupción, es Francia, donde en Francia a las corporaciones ya empiezan a castigarlas como corporaciones en caso de corrupción, que no sé qué significa caso de corrupción en Francia, pero ya es corrupción. Y yo lo que le pregunto a Susan, esa es más pregunta, es qué tanto esta idea de no aplicarle personalidad a las corporaciones tiene que ver con la secrecía, porque esto es lo que en el derecho privado ha sido un gran escudo, el escudo, así como el escudo de las Américas aquí, el escudo de la corrupción corporativa es la secrecía fiscal, la secrecía bancaria, la secrecía profesional, incluso se utilizan todo tipo de secretos, el secreto fiduciario, el secreto bancario, el secreto profesional, el secreto fiscal, para acabar con el combate no solo a la corrupción, sino en este caso al blanqueamiento de activos. Entonces, todo esto que nos dice Susan de la personalidad de las corporaciones, ¿qué tanto tiene que ver con la opacidad y la secrecía? Y esa es mi tercera pregunta y agradezco mucho la atención a todos ustedes. Sí, yo creo que sí.
So that corruption is persecuted criminally, but she was wondering if you could explain a bit more if you think that the fact that companies and private institutions are protected behind privacy and the laws that make them not accountable to what they do, and if that is a way that they are limiting
I don't know enough about the European privacy laws.
Do you agree if we take the comments and then you answer them all together? Okay, so I'll pass the microphone to Guadalupe Correa.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure, Susan, to be here and to have read your very sophisticated and important paper with Tina Zoraide. I don't know if I prepared some comments, very, very short comments in English, because, I wanted to do it in English, and very brief comments in Spanish. So, I mean, this idea, if laws of human rights apply or not to corporations, is key, and something that I don't think about because I'm Mexico and I studied Latin America. But this comparative analysis taught me a lot. So thank you very much for this very excellent and ambitious paper. It's a pleasure to engage with the work that brings together anti-money laundering and antitrust, that are two fields that are rarely analyzed in the conversations. When I think about cartels, I study cartels, and I study, Mexico and Latin America. When I think about antitrust laws and think about, these are the real cartels, right? These are the real cartels. We talk about Exactly. So it was perfect. These two fields that are not very very commonly analyzed, but that clearly share deep structural similarities. So in my very brief remarks, I would like to highlight 3 points: the strength of the paper's core conceptual contribution, second, a need, in my view, for greater precision in the comparison need advances, like, the question of Irma Eréndira. And third, how bringing in the case of Mexico helps to sharpen, probably, and in some ways complicate the argument, much complicate the argument. You're basically, comparing two sophisticated systems, and ours is much more complex. But I always come back to where I belong to. So I think that the paper's most compelling contribution is really the distinction between what the author calls the authors call the cop and the coach models of regulation. This is a powerful and intuitively appealing framework. The paper shows that anti-money laundering regimes tend to operate as supervisory system-oriented frameworks, all that, but that emphasize monitoring, compliance, and ongoing interaction with firms. That's something I don't think about, like really in Mexico. We don't think that about the antitrust. Well, I mean, comparing the two, and antitrust enforcement remain largely investigation-driven and sanction-focused, relying on ex-post adjudication and high penalties as a means of deterrence. At the same time, you both demonstrate that in practice, both systems converge around case-by-case enforcement and the increasing use of large fines, even as the underlying misconduct remains difficult to detect and measure. This insight, for me, is particularly important in a world where corporate wrongdoing is opaque, transnational, and embedded in complex organizational structures. The complexity that's also very well connected with my own analysis. My second point is that the comparison between anti-money laundering and antitrust would benefit greatly from more analytical precision. The paper itself notes a crucial difference in anti-money laundering. Private firms are effectively deputized as agents of the state, tasked with monitoring their clients and reporting suspicious activity. And in antitrust, by contrast, firms are the objects of enforcement, not its instruments. This is not simply a variation with a shared regulatory model. It reflects two fundamentally different governance logics. One is a delegated surveillance regime, and the other is a market correcting regime. Clarifying this distinction more explicitly would definitely strengthen your argument, particularly when it comes to the paper's normative recommendations. It raises an important question: to what extent can lessons from a supervisory compliance-based system like AML be meaningfully transferred to a domain like antitrust, where the state is confronting rather than partnering with private actors? That's a question. And just a third point, which is, the value of introducing a case like Mexico and also complicating it as a kind of stress test for the paper argument. I mean, it's a very complicated paper. I had to read it several times, but to really get a little bit of that. Mexico is particularly relevant because it sits at the intersection of U.S. regulatory influence, global AML standards, especially those promoted by the Financial Actors Task Force, and deeply entrenched illicit economies in the AML domain. Mexico has adopted a very robust, relatively robust on paper, right, formal framework. This is what we all will do very well. We have good people that think about it. So it has implemented FATF standards, strengthened its financial intelligence capacities, and expanded reporting obligations for financial institutions. And yet, large-scale money laundering persists. Enforcement is uneven. It's something that of course, our expert, Irma Eréndira Sandoval, understands very well. And outcomes often appear selective or politicized. This reinforces one of the paper's central claims, that building elaborate compliance system does not necessarily translate into effective deterrence, but the Mexican case also adds another layer to the analysis. It suggests that the problem is not really one of institutional design, but also one of the capacity and political will. The political will is kind of very important. A similar pattern can be observed in antitrust. Mexico's competition authority is often regulated as technically sophisticated and formally independent. However, market concentration remains high in key sectors, and enforcement has had limited success in transforming underlying economic structures. Once again, this aligns with the paper's concern that case-by-case enforcement, even when accompanied by significant fines, may not be sufficient to achieve broader regulatory goals. But here too, the Mexican case highlights something that is less developed in the paper. This is the role of political economy. Regulatory outcomes are shaped not only by legal frameworks, but also by power asymmetries, which is something that, you know, it's in my heart as Mexican, entrenched economic interests and the broader political environment in which agencies operate. What the case of Mexico ultimately suggests is that the question is not only whether regulations should act more like cops or coaches, but also under what conditions they are able to function effectively in either role, right? And that's what I was thinking when I was reading your paper. In contexts where institutions are constrained, fragmented, or subject to political pressures, regulators may struggle to act as either. This does not undermine the paper's argument, but it does point to the importance of integrating more explicitly political economy perspectives into the analysis that we're talking about. And, you know, I just want to conclude by emphasizing that this is a rich, thoughtful, and highly relevant paper. My main suggestion is to sharpen the conceptual distinction at its core and clarify the limits of the comparison itself, and the comparison between AML and antitrust, and more fully incorporate cases like Mexico that highlight the importance of state capacity and the political context, the political economy content of this. Doing so would not only strengthen the argument, but also broaden its relevance beyond the transatlantic comparison. With that in mind, I'm not saying that you have to incorporate the Mexican case into the paper, but it would be interesting to have like a panel or, you know, I mean, something else where people can discuss the very important case of Mexico. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Guadalupe. Max, your turn, please.
Ready?
Es un honor estar, gracias, participando en esta. Está participando, ¿sí me escuchan? Sí.
A ver,
si no, pasamos el primero, Max.
No sé,
por favor.
Si llega.
Sí llega.
Está conectado, creo.
Sí llega.
Gracias. Bueno, pues muy buenas tardes a todas y a todos. Es para mí un gran honor participar en esta mesa en donde estamos escuchando principalmente a la doctora Susan Rose-Ackerman. I'm a huge fan. Sin duda, para aquellos que nos dedicamos un poco al tema de la transparencia y la rendición de cuentas, la literatura que la doctora Susan ha producido es fundamental para entender el fenómeno, y en ese sentido, pues agradezco mucho la invitación y también la oportunidad de estar con colegas tan destacadas que han también hecho contribuciones muy importantes a lo que se discute hoy, que tiene que ver precisamente sí con elementos de la política económica, pero también, como lo señala el propio título del seminario, con prácticas de corrupción, de rendición de cuentas, de impunidad, y todo eso se cruza justamente en el paper que pudimos revisar para esta sesión. Yo igual voy a procurar ser muy breve con mi comentario. Creo que es más bien importante escuchar las respuestas o las ideas de la doctora Susan, y yo voy a orientar un poco mi participación respecto a los temas que conozco, que tienen que ver precisamente con la administración pública, en específico, pues la importancia del diseño institucional para que puedan generarse mejores condiciones de vida para la población. Uno podría pensar que el tema del lavado de dinero, pues a veces nos resulta ajeno porque pensamos en estas grandes empresas que mueven capitales a nivel internacional y pensamos que nuestro bolsillo como ciudadanos no tienen implicaciones mayores, y me parece que sí lo es, y el paper nos muestra con mucha claridad justo cómo estas dinámicas se relacionan con elementos que tienen que ver con la democracia, incluso con el mercado en el sentido público, y también con las propias instituciones de gobierno. Y a mí en particular me llama mucho la atención cómo la doctora Susan introduce precisamente el tema del lavado de dinero a partir de una visión mucho más novedosa, es decir, no solamente quedarnos con esta idea, como ya mencionaba, del flujo de capitales que se generan de manera ilícita, sino cómo en un ambiente que se ha vuelto más complejo a partir de los fenómenos de la globalización y también del uso de la tecnología, pues suelen ser actividades que ya no se detectan con tanta facilidad, y eso supone un reto muy importante para las instituciones públicas. ¿De qué manera podemos controlar y atender este fenómeno del lavado de dinero sin afectar pues la lógica del mercado, que requiere pues cierta libertad para poder generar principalmente dos cuestiones que lo articulan en términos institucionales? Por un lado, el reducir los costos de transacción, y por otro, el asignar, como lo dice la literatura clásica, asignar de manera eficiente los bienes y servicios, ¿no? Entonces estamos, me parece que en una reflexión muy interesante que en el diseño institucional es muy importante y que tiene que ver con la identificación de los valores que vamos a promover. ¿Qué nos va a interesar más en la regulación? ¿El castigar la actividad que consideramos ilícita o el no afectar, como señala el propio título de la conferencia y del paper, el no afectar la libertad del mercado para que esto pueda desarrollarse de manera eficiente? Y además, la doctora Susan me parece que pone énfasis en un punto que, salvo la mejor opinión de los expertos aquí en México, no solemos discutir tanto, y que tiene que ver con la conexión entre diferentes ramas del derecho. Ella nos pone dos en la mesa, que es el derecho penal y por otro lado el derecho administrativo, y la gran pregunta que ella hace es cómo los combinamos, de qué manera articulamos una política mucho más eficiente para combatir este fenómeno, poniendo énfasis en lo que puede decirnos el derecho penal en términos de castigo, de sanción, de definición de tipos penales, y por otra, los mecanismos administrativos que nos pueden ayudar a regular de mejor manera a ciertos actores que, no hay que desconocer, tienen un poder económico muy importante y que en esa medida pues es difícil controlarlos. Aquí hay un concepto que me vino, digamos, a la mente sin que esté desde luego en el texto, y que ni siquiera sé si es correcto decirlo así, pero me parece que esta idea que ella plantea sobre una especie de discrecionalidad positiva, es decir, que sea la autoridad quien decida bajo ciertos criterios si se elige el canal penal o se elige el canal administrativo, y eso me parece importante porque eso nos vuelve a colocar en el centro de la discusión la importancia que tiene la autoridad pública como un actor que decide, pero que decide a partir de ciertos criterios que no necesariamente van a estar estandarizados en la norma. Y eso pues es un elemento fundamental para esta discusión sobre diseño institucional que me parece está apoyando el argumento de la lectura. Yo iría cerrando esta inquietud en términos de qué tipo de elementos tendríamos que considerar en el planteamiento de un diseño institucional que nos pueda ayudar a atender este fenómeno, que en este caso sí, insisto, está centrado en la idea del lavado de dinero, pero que me parece que puede ser replicable a otras decisiones de gobierno, y que tiene que ver con la importancia que tiene el funcionamiento de las instituciones en la atención de este tipo de cuestiones que pueden generar distorsiones en el mercado. E inicio, digamos, como este panorama del diseño institucional con un elemento que me parece clave, que es la confianza. Sobre todo en el caso del mercado, de la regulación de las actividades económicas, un elemento sustantivo que debe reflejar la autoridad en su actividad es la idea de confianza, pero esta no se genera sola, sino que se requieren un conjunto de insumos para que esta pueda surgir, y que van de la mano de otros elementos que se han puesto aquí en la mesa, que tiene que ver, por ejemplo, con la certeza, con la integridad, incluso ya no solamente en el sector público, sino también en el sector privado. Y como ya lo decía muy bien la doctora Irma, si esto no está arropado de una clara política de no impunidad, pues de poco nos servirían instituciones que nos permitan funcionar en este sentido. Yo dejaría únicamente una pregunta a la doctora Susan sobre la mesa, que tiene que ver sobre el diseño de la agencia responsable de este tipo de políticas. En México tenemos a la Unidad de Inteligencia Financiera, que es la principal responsable del combate al lavado de dinero, pero en donde, lo voy a decir tal cual, sin filtros, pues resultados claros en esta materia, pues prácticamente no vemos. Estamos más bien centrados en otro tipo de dinámicas que tienen que ver con el dinero ilícito en campañas electorales, pero no necesariamente prácticas de lavado como se expusieron aquí. Entonces a mí me gustaría mucho escuchar la respuesta de la doctora en términos de qué encontró en esta revisión comparada que hizo, pensando en el diseño de las agencias responsables para atender este fenómeno. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, Max, también. Vamos a permitirle a la doctora Susan Rose que nos haga una primera réplica a los comentarios y después vamos a abrir el espacio para que si alguien más quiere preguntar también. ¿Ya? You agree with that? Yeah. Okay. we're gonna allow you. You have no choice. What I was telling is we're gonna give you the microphone now so you can reply to the comments you just heard, and then afterwards we can open the for questions from the audience.
Rest of the gang.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your comments. Very, very good comments. You're right to emphasize political will. In any complicated reform area, there's got to be somebody who wants to reform and who has the toughness to push to make it happen, because it's not easy. And there's going to be all kinds of people who want to do something else. Right? And you're right, we certainly didn't really take that on here. And it's of course hard to know exactly how to take it on. The other part of it, of course, is that many of these things that you mentioned, the financial action, both of you mentioned the Financial Action Task Force, which is, I think, a very interesting international institution, not created by any kind of legal treaty. It just has some kind of clout in terms of its recommendations. But given that the problem, both of these problems I'm talking about have an international dimension, both antitrust and money laundering, there is inevitably going to be some tension between what happened or some weakness in what an individual state can do. They can set a model, for other places maybe, but it needs to be part of the broader discussion. Obviously, one paper is not taking on all the possible things that could happen, but you're certainly right to raise the political will question. I should mention Tina, my co-author, who was head of the antitrust agency in Norway, which was she was a single head at will employee under the Ministry of Commerce. And at least you could partly understand what was happening to her was that the Ministry of Commerce didn't like how aggressive she was being. Right? Right? So this is Norway, which is not a very corrupt place, but there's power struggles, anywhere you look, and it's true in this paper. We haven't denied, obviously we understand there are power struggles, but to just focus on some part of it. But you're right, that's certainly a piece of it. Your this sort of questions of the what administrative law is like in Mexico. I've had some conversations with people over the years about that, and I think your administrative law has some features that I think are not, and you have to correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't speak as an expert on Mexico. The parts of U.S. administrative law that I think are very strong but are under threat. Of course, everything's under threat in the U.S. right now. So things that I thought were entrenched are not. But one of the things that is an important part of U.S. administrative law is that when general rules are made, in most cases, they need to go through something called a notice and comment process, in which there's the rule is made, a draft of it is made public on the Federal Register. There's a hearing process within the agency, which must be open to anybody who wants to come forward. It's not up to the minister to decide who to hear from. Hear from anybody. Now that means, of course, they may get 1 million comments, so that's going to be a little unmanageable. But still, it has a basic principle that the outside can come in, and a lot of criticism. I would have a lot of criticisms of the actual way it works, but I think there's some important core there. And then the agency has to give reasons when it comes out with a general rule that has the force of law. And then there's judicial review of whether that it was arbitrary and capricious or consistent with statute. This is being basically undermined right now by the current administration. So this is we have living example of the relationship between the tensions between some underlying set of rules and the sort of will of the leaders. And you probably have examples like this in Mexico too, right? So it's and we're not. This paper is not. I have some criticisms. I've written some things about the current administration, but this paper is not particularly about that. But I don't want anybody to think we don't recognize that there's a broader kind of context within which this is going on. You know? Okay. So, anything else?
Thank you, Susan. Bueno, pues entonces abrimos a las preguntas. No sé si tenemos el micrófono que se pueda pasar, ¿sí? Si quieres, sácalo de la base para que funcione mejor.
Sí, muchas gracias a todos los que vinieron y aquí el doctor, si se presentan rápidamente también para que...
Gracias, muy amable, doctora. Es un placer estar en esta reunión compartiendo la mesa con ustedes. José Jorge Eufrasio, de la Facultad de Economía en la Universidad Veracruzana. Estamos acá porque hemos tenido la oportunidad de intercambiar perspectivas académicas con la doctora Irma Eréndira y con el interés por el tema de corrupción en general y haciendo una tesis en esa materia. Y mi comentario va en el siguiente sentido, y creo que quise participar de primera instancia porque quiero darle continuidad a la intervención del doctor Maximiliano García, que puso énfasis en la parte del diseño institucional y vincularlo justamente con el lavado de dinero. En mi opinión, probablemente pueda ser meritorio analizar el lavado de dinero y también la corrupción, que finalmente el lavado de dinero es un tipo de corrupción, desde la perspectiva de policy capacities, es decir, de capacidades de política pública, que algunos autores como Wu, Ramesh y Howlett han destacado en ciertos papers que me han llegado y he revisado en últimas fechas. Básicamente, creo que si queremos analizar el tema del lavado de dinero y ciertamente la corrupción, no podríamos prescindir de concentrar mucho de la atención en justo lo que usted comentó, doctor. ¿Cómo están diseñadas las instituciones en nuestro país y si nuestras instituciones tienen capacidades políticas, operativas, administrativas, legales, ¿verdad? Claves y críticas para poder actuar con relativa, porque la total independencia no existe, pero sí con relativa independencia. Yo diría que de primera instancia hay dos elementos que tendríamos que tomar en cuenta. Primero, que tenga autonomía política y segundo, que existan capacidades administrativas reales. ¿A qué tipo de capacidades administrativas reales me estoy refiriendo? Pues, por ejemplo, un servicio civil de carrera, gente preparada que pueda hacer análisis, hacer evaluación de riesgos, identificar fortalezas y debilidades, tener un presupuesto asegurado, continuidad en él, etcétera, etcétera. Pero ciertamente que el titular de la institución tenga esa independencia mínima que le permita guardar cierta distancia respecto de los poderes reales. ¿Cuáles? Poder ejecutivo, poder legislativo y, ¿por qué no?, también el judicial. E incluso alguien diría ahí, desde el punto de vista de la teoría económica o de capture theory, tener también cierta independencia de los poderes fácticos, ¿no? Finalmente, no quiero extender mi participación, pero creo que haría falta o sería necesario retomar otras experiencias que existen, por ejemplo, en términos de los reguladores de servicios públicos privatizados, lo que se conoce como Public Utility Regulation, que en determinados países, en Europa, por ejemplo, en Inglaterra, todos los servicios públicos fueron privatizados, pero la administración de estos servicios públicos quedó en manos de un grupo de individuos profesionalmente muy capaces, con un director general que que bueno, tenía renombre, es elegido de manera independiente como un cuerpo técnico y no como un cuerpo político. Entonces, probablemente sería interesante recuperar y rescatar el valor de estas agencias individuales administrativamente bastante independientes, que ya hay antecedentes en la administración pública, y entonces sí, aquello de si es más importante el derecho penal o el derecho administrativo o the other way around, o al contrario, creo que tendría o podría tener una dimensión distinta. Es cuanto. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Jorge. Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta?
1, 2, ¿quién más para
Acá.
contabilizar y saber esta ronda?
Buenas tardes, servidor. Mi nombre es Domingo Ramírez López. Quiero agradecer a la doctora Irma por invitarnos a este seminario de combate a la corrupción y rendición de cuentas. Doctora Rose, tengo una pregunta ahí. Susan, concreta, en el sentido de que en México no existen tribunales especializados que juzguen hechos de corrupción relacionados con personas morales o empresas. ¿Tiene usted algún referente, ya sea en Estados Unidos o en América Latina, de algún tribunal que haya surtido efecto para combatir este fenómeno?
Gracias. Gracias. ¿Alguien más? Sí, sí.
Buenas tardes. Quiero agradecer a la doctora Irma Eréndira Sandoval por su invitación. Mi nombre es Veranda Ramírez, vengo de Chiapas, de la Universidad Autónoma de Chiapas. Es un gusto y un placer estar aquí escuchando a la doctora Susan. Y mi pregunta sería, en la investigación que actualmente estoy realizando en temas de rendición de cuentas municipales en Chiapas, ¿cuál sería su recomendación, doctora, en cuanto a qué elementos consideraría básicos para un sistema municipal como el que tenemos en Chiapas, que carece o necesita más elementos para tener confianza en las instituciones municipales que adolecemos actualmente? Muchas gracias.
Gracias, doctora. Ok, tomamos uno más, ¿no? Y luego ok.
Hola, ¿qué tal? Yo soy Jex Quiroz, estudiante de la maestría con la doctora Irma Eréndira. Muchas gracias, doctora Susan, por su ponencia. Mi pregunta sería, ¿qué contrapropuesta existe desde el mundo privado justamente a combatir el lavado de dinero? ¿Y qué tensiones ha suscitado sus ideas acerca de cómo combatirlo en Estados Unidos? Es decir, ¿qué otros caminos son como más convencionales o que rivalizan con sus ideas? Y si hay algún otro país que le haya llamado la atención y que le gustaría a lo mejor incorporarlo en sus escritos a futuro, más allá de esta comparación noratlántica, ¿no? De Estados Unidos y de Europa. Gracias.
Gracias. Okay, so can we give you the microphone back, yeah, to answer the question?
All right. Let me start backwards. I think we should. I don't have a good answer to your question. I think that's a research project for you, right? But a place to look is the Financial Action Task Force, because they do country evaluations every few years and publish their information. Now, of course, it's always a problem, as Render and I know, with corruption. People don't want to let you know about it, right? So therefore, it's very hard to do research on it, and you need to find some kind of. Sometimes you can have proxies for some, that you like. This couldn't be true unless there were, the price of this couldn't be, $1,000 unless there were corruption, or there are people who find things out. So it's not easy, but that's, I think, looking at the Financial Action Task Force is one place to go. You were asking about special courts. The United States is weak on special courts. You know, there's the idea. This probably comes out of that sort of common law background. You know, there are administrative law judges inside of independent different agencies. They are not judges in the judiciary sense, in the Article 3 sense, but they have the name. They wanted a nice label. They wanted to be called judges. So, but they specialize, and some of them are very. So, for example, there are administrative law judges in the Securities and Exchange Commission, who therefore know an awful lot about the kind of regulation that the Securities and Exchange Commission does. The Justice Department has some. So that's a place to look for people who have their opinions and have some actual knowledge about it. What would be interesting, and I don't know that anybody studied it, is okay, take their decisions and then say, when are they overturned by the judiciary, the regular judiciary, which mostly doesn't know anything, you know, about these questions. As you know, I'm sure there are countries that have separate administrative law tracks. Germany has and France have both Conseil d'Etat and single thing that there are judges who focus just on administrative law. Germany has a social welfare court and a labor court, not a corruption court. Some of you may know, there's proposals for guys are proposing an international anti-corruption court, which would be to try heads of state who are corrupt. I think this is a terrible idea. And why not? I mean, if it existed, it might be okay, but why would it ever exist? Why would a country ruled by a kleptocrat ratify a treaty that was going to make it possible to hold that person to account for how they were acting? So I just think it's a non-starter. You should think about other ways in which countries should share information about what's going on, permit more collaboration across borders. But I just say beware of that proposal, because there's these guys very aggressively pushing it, and it seems to me completely unrealistic. Now I've got to get back to the earlier. Who is this? It was you. Somebody was making a point about political actions and professional expertise. Yeah. That was you, right? Okay. Too many people asking questions. Exactly right set of things to be concerned about. If you're following anything that's going on in the U.S. right now, there are two cases below the Supreme Court. One particularly on the Federal Reserve, and the other more generally about whether it's constitutional for us to have independent agencies, which we've had, clearly since the end of the 19th century. And some people say even before that, they were de facto independent agencies going way back to close to the independent in the sense that their decisions couldn't be overturned by somebody someplace else in the administration. And the argument was exactly that these people had expertise. And a ability, at least in hope, that they could be therefore independently use that expertise to make decisions about the regulation of, say, the railroads or telecommunications, other kinds of things. Another aspect of those is that they have, most of them have an odd number of people appointed from different parties, approved by the Senate. So there may be like a law that may say only three of one part, no more than three from one party. So they have some kind of bipartisan distribution. And they seem to have worked pretty well. They're not criticism, they're not great, but they seem to do pretty well in combining a respect for expertise with the idea that these are decisions which at least need to be justified in various bipartisan terms. It's an odd solution, right? We're trying to get something bipartisan appointments in the first place. But the idea is they've got to somehow work together to come out with it, and that's at risk right now in the U.S., which I think could be extremely unfortunate. But they exist other places too, and that's certainly one model or one way of dealing with some of the things you're talking about. I think that's perfect. I'm sure I missed somebody, but that's all right.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Rose-Ackerman. It was a pleasure having you here, and I think the audience has many more questions, but I hope they can keep on channeling them through Irma and through reading your work and working on it. It's been a...
You sent me a question in Spanish, and it's fine. I have not just my son and daughter-in-law, but I have friends and other friends at Yale who are students. I've supervised a lot of students from Mexico and other places in Latin America, so I can easily find out what you actually said.
Yeah, well, thank you for that compromise too, and it was a great pleasure to have you here today. Thank you very much, and muchas gracias a todos.